Prisoner number E19553, Ernie Clarke, is now serving a life sentence in Wakefield Prison. Clarke was convicted 3 years ago of murdering and dismembering a young girl. Despite the elaborate investigation into Clarke's case, only one piece of evidence, this blue jumper, actually linked him with the crime. We have now produced new evidence which shows that this jumper had nothing to do with the killing, and that Clarke should never have been convicted. The former Attorney General, the Right Honourable Sam Silkin, has been studying the Clarke case and the new evidence our research has produced. South Shields is purpose-built, not pretty. It sprawls along the south bank of the River Tyne. The purpose is sea trade, and the cargoes that arrive are mostly undramatic. Some of them, fuel oils and chemicals, are piped ashore here, into the old storage tanks of Velva Liquids. They are awesome structures, riveted together at the end of the last century, like dreadnoughts that will never put to sea. On Sunday, the 24th of June, 1979, this petrol tank, number 1, was standing empty, ready to be cleaned. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Mick Mallenby and his mate Eddie Dawson duly climbed inside through this opening. As they stood there in the black sludge, the petrol vapour and the gloom, they noticed a plastic bag. Mick picked it up, and a human torso fell out. The two men scrambled to get out of the tank and to get hold of the police. Eddie Dawson actually had the nerve to go back inside tank number 1 again, this time with Police Sergeant Duncan. He noticed another, smaller bundle. After no one knew how many years, the storage depot had yielded up a human head and a human torso. The legs of the body were never found, but whose body was it? The job of identification must have seemed impossible. The police took the remains to a Home Office pathologist.
Her height was 5 foot 3 inches. She had auburn shoulder-length head hair. Her eyes were blue. She had pierced ears. She had a broken collarbone, healed collarbone. She was of slim build. She had well-manicured fingernails. Examination of the teeth showed presence of a high fluoride content, and that enabled the police to narrow down the area of search to South Shields and Jarrow areas of Newcastle upon Tyne. That was the first breakthrough. Further examination of the teeth by my dental colleague showed that the deceased had a very rare abnormality of some teeth. And finally, X-ray examination of the jaws and teeth concurred with what we had found from X-ray examination of the arm bones regarding her age, and which was finally estimated at between 16 and 20, and closer to 16 than to 20.
The police were now searching the missing persons files for a 16-year-old local girl. This girl, Eileen McDougall, fitted the description. She had vanished in early 1970.
The police were able to record, obtain the fingerprint impressions and compare this with finger impressions on a school report dated 1965. And they came up with 8 points of comparison.
It was a brilliant piece of detection. It would greatly impress the jury. The body in Tank 1 was definitely Eileen McDougall. But now came a much more formidable task. Who had killed her, and how had she come to be in here? Well, clearly somebody had climbed onto the top of tank number 1, lifted up this hatch, and dropped the body in. The police concluded that whoever had done that must have known about the site. They reasoned that no one else could get into the site easily. They thought the murderer must have known the tank wasn't due to be cleaned. In many ways, the only clues were on the body itself. According to the forensic scientists, Eileen must have died sometime between 1970 and 1973, but she'd been put in here within 4 days of her death. The forensic evidence said that she'd been hit over the head at least 5 times, probably by a hammer like this one. The police found several of these hammers on the site. The blows suggested that she'd been hit while in an upright position, and the forensic scientists added that the assault would have caused a lot of bleeding. Sometime after that assault, the body had been cut up and put into plastic bags, with the head wrapped in canvas. Both the bags and the canvas could have come from the site. Also, there were stones embedded in the body, which could have come from the coke barrier surrounding Velva Liquids. Wherever the body had been cut up, there would have been a lot of blood. That was all the evidence the police had concerning the dead body. But there was one other area of investigation, the life that Eileen McDougall had led until the day she vanished in January 1970. The Whiteleys estate had been Eileen's home for most of her life. It lies at the other end of the town from Velva. Eileen had 1 brother and 5 sisters. Her mother looked after them all here in the family house. Her father travelled the world working as a tank cleaner. At school, Eileen was bright but rebellious. As a teenager, she was put on report and later suspended. She ran away from home several times, and in 1969 she was put on probation for stealing a handbag. Her sister, Elizabeth, had already left home and found herself a flat. Eileen would visit her there. It was a lot more exciting, after all, than the family home. There was the attraction of the ships and the sea in this area called Law Top. It's just a few minutes away from Velva Liquids. It overlooks the site. For Eileen, there was the greater attraction of the amusements on the seafront. She was much admired by the boys in the fairground. The whole area must have seemed like a fairground to Eileen. Many of the houses are subdivided into flats. Young people, like her sister, were finding their first freedoms away from the family. Eileen did several jobs, and being a pretty, vivacious girl, she had several boyfriends. The family and its institutions were left firmly behind. Some nights, Eileen helped her sister to look after these 3 children. Their father was a man called Ernie Clarke, who was working night shifts at the Velva Liquids site. But this new life was leading to her death. In December '69, Eileen disappeared for about 2 weeks. She wasn't seen around the town. By New Year, she had left South Shields for Maidstone in Kent to stay with her brother Billy and his wife. It was to be her only trip south. After 2 weeks in Maidstone, Billy brought Eileen back to South Shields. But she didn't return to her home, and she didn't ask any of her family or friends if she could stay with them. It was January the 16th, 1970. The weather was cold with a suggestion of snow in the air. Eileen seems to have known that there was somewhere that she could stay the night. She and her brother Billy arrived back in South Shields about 2:30 p.m. She left him at his favourite pub, the Ship and Royal. Somewhere nearby, she quickly changed her dress. She had been wearing a black and red tweed skirt. Now she changed into a revealing see-through dress. Wherever she went, she was back to meet Elizabeth at this pub before 3 o'clock. Later that night, Eileen was at this nightclub. She went to a boyfriend's house, but no one knows where she slept. The next day, the Saturday, her mother saw her in the shopping centre. But although she was being seen near the town centre, no one knows where she was living. Eileen was last seen in this street here. Most of the houses have now been knocked down. It's just over half an hour's walk from her home in Whiteleys over there. Just under half an hour's walk from Velva Liquids over there. She came here to a boyfriend's house about 2:30 a.m. on the Sunday morning. It was raining and her t-shirt and jeans were wet through. The temperature was just above freezing. She said she'd been thrown out and needed somewhere to sleep. The boy let her in. At 7 o'clock that same morning, the boy's father caught the two of them together, and Eileen was out on the streets once more. Her t-shirt and jeans still wet through, the temperature still just above freezing. Apparently no one, except the murderer, ever saw her alive again. It was a familiar, sad story of a young girl with a lot of boyfriends and a regular need for a night's lodging. Only one part of it interested the police. That was the babysitting job that Eileen had occasionally done with Elizabeth. The father of the 3 children happened to work at Velva Liquids. His name was Ernie Clarke. He turned out to be the only man who had worked at Velva at the time of Eileen's disappearance who ever admitted he had known her. What's more, he had left Velva just 13 days after Eileen's disappearance. The police set out to trace him and to ask about his relationship with Eileen. A week after Eileen's body was identified, Clarke was brought here to the police station at South Shields. He agreed he had known Eileen, though he said that he had known her sister Elizabeth far better. He strongly denied having anything to do with her disappearance. Clarke said that he hadn't left Velva Liquids of his own accord. He'd been sacked because he disagreed with the decision to promote one of his workmates, Ronnie Embleton. After the sacking, he stayed in South Shields for 9 months and then moved south to find a job in Hull. On the Sunday when Eileen vanished, Clarke had been working on the Velva Liquids site from 7 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, when his colleague Ronnie Embleton came to take over. Clarke was a man of good reputation. His only previous involvement with the police had been in connection with the theft of a post office bank book. The police could find nothing more than a casual relationship between Clarke and Eileen, and indeed she might even have been killed after he left South Shields. But then a particularly damning piece of evidence turned up. This new evidence wasn't about tank number 1, where the body had been found, but about tank number 4, a much smaller tank at the other end of the site. The evidence came from Ronnie Embleton, Clarke's workmate, whose promotion had led to Clarke's dismissal. While the police were still questioning Clarke, Embleton told them that he had remembered something from 9.5 years beforehand.
I went over to the tank 4, and Ernie was in the process of just shutting his valve off. And I went come behind him. He was on his knees, sort of thing. And I says, I looked at the channel, I could see, you know, that he had flooded it through. I said, what have you done that for, Ernie, you know? And hardly audible, but he said, oh, that's nothing, man, you know. And I just knew, you know, that I wasn't in wanted, you know, so I just diddled off. And I just never thought no more of it at the time, you know. And when the case came up, I got to thinking, and I thought, well, I better go and report it.
Embleton also said that Clarke had been adding bricks to the channel under Tank 4 and filling in a hole nearby, but the police never showed that either action had anything to do with the girl's death. The police investigated Tank 4. It was full of wax, which was normally kept heated and liquid. Once it cooled, it set, and several tons of it had set under Tank 4. 20 feet inside the left-hand channel, and about a foot down in the wax, the police found this, part of a girl's blue jumper. It had been slit down the back and across the arms with a sharp knife, as if, said the police, it had been cut off a dead body. It was heavily impregnated with the wax. The jumper would have fitted a girl 5'4" of Eileen's slim build. The family confirmed that it was the kind of garment that Eileen might have been wearing about the time she disappeared. This piece of evidence was what the police had been waiting for. The jumper caused Clarke's arrest. The corroboration it seemed to provide formed the centre of Clarke's trial for the murder of Eileen McDougall. That trial took place at Newcastle Crown Court almost a year after the discovery of Eileen's body. For 8 days, the jury picked their way through the details of Eileen's death. Throughout, Clarke continued to protest his innocence. At one point, he, the jury and the judge all went to see the Velva Liquids site. They looked under Tank 4, where the incriminating jumper had been discovered, and at Tank 1, where the body had been dumped. On Friday, June the 13th, the jury unanimously returned a verdict of guilty to murder. Clarke was sentenced to life imprisonment. Clarke was convicted because of the evidence of the blue jumper. Because he had access to the site, would have known Tank 1 wasn't due for cleaning and could have found the canvas packing. Because he knew Eileen, even though many people knew her well. Clarke's lawyers were very disturbed by the verdict, but there were no good grounds for appeal. The Justice Organisation in London were asked to help. They passed it on to us. We began to analyse the evidence, and we began where we hoped there might be documents, at Tank 4. We discovered that Tank 4 had been used for the storage of two types of chemical, stearyl alcohol and lauryl alcohol. Both substances look like candle grease, but to any scientist they are quite distinct and easily identifiable. We also managed to find the original exhibits which had been in evidence at the trial, including the blue jumper. We consulted Dr. Patrick Toseland, a senior forensic scientist and Home Office expert on alcohols. The samples of wax from the jumper and from the spillage under Tank 4 were subjected to the most detailed tests by Dr. Toseland. He had found the exhibits quite uncontaminated, just as they had come from the courtroom. From the computer printout, we wanted to know what kind of wax had been in the channel under Tank 4 and what sort had covered the jumper.
The jumper, as you can see here, shows mostly this large compound here, which is stearyl alcohol with a small amount of a lower alcohol, C16.
What does that suggest to you?
The jumper could only have been in the channel at the time stearyl alcohol was spilt or poured onto it.
Next, we consulted the management of Velva Liquids, whose files were still intact.
Well, they're quite clear. They show that stearyl alcohol was stored in Tank 4 until April 1969. The quantity in the tank was gradually delivered during that month, and in the period between April 69 and August 69, the tank was obviously emptied and cleaned. In August 1969, a cargo of lauryl alcohol was received, and that material was stored in that tank until at least the end of 1970.
So there's no way then, you would say, that stearyl alcohol could have come out of that tank any time after April 1969?
No, after April 69 it is possible, but certainly not after August 69, because by that time there was lauryl alcohol in the tank.
So the records at Velva Liquids show that stearyl alcohol was last stored there 9 months before Eileen was killed. That is, until the end of April 69. The tank then lay fallow for 3 months, was cleaned, and then in August 69 it received 300 tons of the quite different substance lauryl alcohol. These files, which show that the jumper had nothing to do with the murder, were not given to the defence at the trial. The police have only returned them to Velva this year. The evidence then is clear. The material in this, the left-hand channel under tank number 4, was predominantly stearyl alcohol. The jumper was found a foot beneath the surface. It was heavily impregnated with stearyl alcohol. Therefore, it can only have been placed there before August 1969. Had Ernie Clarke flooded this channel after August 1969, as he's alleged to have done, the jumper would have been immersed in a quite different substance, lauryl alcohol. We showed the documents from Velva Liquids to Dr. Toseland. He was in no doubt about their significance.
The jumper cannot be connected with the girl's body. This is one of the planks of evidence against Clarke, and I think this demonstrates that this plank is now removed.
So, if it was scientifically impossible for the blue jumper to be connected with the crime, the question remains, how did it get there under tank 4, cut up as if from a dead body? The answer is simple. Petrol storage depots are grubby places, so they buy in quantities of industrial rags. In 1969, Velva were buying their rags from this firm in Dewsbury, Stanley Beaumont. For 23 years, Ivy Woods has worked here. We told her nothing about our investigation. We just asked her to cut up some jumpers on the machine that she'd have used back in 1969. Ivy, can I stop you there? I just want to show you this as it's spread out. Is this the way you always cut them?
Yes.
So straight up the back and along the sleeves, is that right?
Yeah.
And how long have you been doing it?
Since 1960.
Since 1960, so 23 years. Can I just switch this off a second?
Yeah.
So, were you cutting T-shirts like that or jumpers like that in 1969?
Yes.
We have another thing to show you here. I wonder what you think about this. What does that look like to you?
Oh, that looks identical to that one.
Does it look like the kind of thing that you'd have cut and the way you'd have cut it?
It's cut exactly the same as that one's cut there.
This is the jumper that was described by the prosecution as having been cut up as if from a dead body. It was probably nothing more than a rag. Ronnie Embleton said that Clarke had been running off the wax around January 1970, near the time of Eileen's disappearance. Now he claims he was never sure.
Well, honestly, in all honesty, I couldn't say when that happened. You know, it's within that period of time. You know, the 9 years, as you say, there hadn't been still in there for 9 months. I honestly thought it was shorter, you know. As you say, time plays funny things with your memory.
But you'd be prepared to say now that it could have been April 69, would you?
Well, I think, you know, according to the records of the products.
The scientific facts do show that, don't they? What did you think when we showed you the jumper cut up, looking exactly like the jumper that was supposed to have been Eileen McDougall's?
I was rather shocked, actually.
At his trial, Clarke admitted he knew Eileen, but there was no physical relationship between them. He couldn't deny that he had had access to the site in January 1970 when Eileen vanished, and a hammer found on the site was the right size to match the wounds. But there was nothing to connect Eileen with Clarke in the last month before she disappeared. Many other people knew Eileen, and we've now found evidence that could explain where she was sleeping during the last 2 days of her life. You'll recall that when Eileen came back to South Shields from Maidstone, she came along here and changed her dress somewhere near the centre of town. Well, the police obviously thought that she'd gone to Ernie Clarke's house just a few minutes away from the town centre. But there's no evidence to support that. But there is evidence that Eileen knew of another flat also near the town centre. It wasn't so much a flat, more the kind of hippie commune which flourished briefly at the end of the 60s. It seems to have been open house where young people could find shelter. Gail Sorensen was one of those young people. She went to the house several times and she saw Eileen there.
Everybody used to go. Everybody who was into drugs or anything used to go there. And that was the only place in Shields then where people could go for a smoke or whatever, you know. So there was always loads of people there.
And is it the sort of place that a young girl would have found exciting or attractive? Or?
Oh, I should think so, I did. I just think it was great.
And was it the kind of place where you could be guaranteed to get a bed to sleep?
Oh, yes. I mean, they used to have people dusting all over the floor. We used to wake up in the morning, there was loads of people dusting on the floor.
Did you see Eileen McDougall there?
Yes. Eileen came with Mary Bell. I remember there was 3 girls. There was Mary Bell, Eileen, and there was this other girl, but I can't remember her name.
This girl also went to that same open house near the town centre. At the age of 15, she was left there alone to babysit. It turned out to be highly dangerous.
Somebody came to the door. They didn't actually knock because the person that came knew that there was no lock on the door. So this man came in. He told me that the lady I was babysitting for said he could come and wait for her returning. So I let the man in. I put the baby to bed. The man lit the fire for us. He walked back over towards me, and then I just felt a thud on my head, on the back of my head. My head went down, and all I remember is he was kicking and punching us in the face.
This girl survived the assault. Her attacker was never caught. Eileen McDougall was just a year older. She was seen visiting the house on several occasions. The final point in the case against Clarke is that he had access to the site, where materials like the canvas to wrap part of the body could have been found. He was also incriminated because a hammer on the site matched the wounds on Eileen's head. We went to the largest hardware store in South Shields to examine the hammers. On sale to the public, we found 6 hammers which could have inflicted the wounds. The canvas we discovered was common to many of the ships and was regularly left around the site. The only key point remaining was access, how to get in. Harry Peterson, the site manager, is the longest-serving man at Velva. He remembers it clearly in 1970, at the time Eileen disappeared. For 20 years or more, Harry Peterson has had the problem of keeping the local fishermen off the Velva jetty. Why did fishermen want to get onto this jetty?
Well, it's apparent that it was a better fishing spot than anywhere on the river. It's deeper water. There's about 32, 34 foot of water down at the jetty. And the fishing of the tides was a great thing, and it could cast into the middle of the stream.
What was access like to this site back in 1969, 1970?
Well, the place was very vulnerable in all measures, from the east to the west to the jetty entrance.
People could get in easily?
Quite easily, quite easily.
How easy was it to get in where we are, just behind you there? How easy was it to get in over that wall?
Quite easily. That barbed wire was only put on at a later date after we were having trouble. And as you can see there, this was added on the spikes and so forth. There was only a mesh fencing where it could break through and come through quite easily.
The jetty at Velva may explain how Eileen's body ever came to be on the site. Access was easy, and many people knew it would be a natural place to dispose of a body. When Eileen disappeared, the water here would be over 40 feet deep, with strong currents. There have always been unanswered questions in the case of Ernie Clarke. He would know that petrol didn't corrode flesh, so why put the body in a petrol tank? Why indeed put the body in your own place of work? And since he had access to this jetty, why didn't he just drop Eileen's body off the end? Perhaps the murderer did dispose of the lower half of the body from the jetty, and then when he returned here with the rest of the body, he may have seen some fishermen at the end of the jetty. Perhaps standing here at the entrance to the jetty, he panicked and took the body as far as he could across the site, and that would have taken him to tank number 1. Unless, of course, he worked for Velva Liquids, in which case he'd have the right to clear the fishermen off the jetty. Tom Sargent of the Justice Organisation is now working with Clarke's solicitor on an appeal to the Home Secretary.
I think that the findings about the jumper really destroy the main evidence on which Clarke was convicted. And I was fascinated to see in Ronald Embleton's evidence that, in fact, looking back, he was not at all certain about the dates. Dr. Pat Tosland's evidence about the different types of alcohol involved in the case was very important. It could be said that it could have been ferreted out from the depositions, but there's no indication in the trial transcript that this was done or that this important discrepancy was brought to the notice of the jury.
We consulted the Right Honourable Sam Silkin QC, the former Attorney General. He studied the case and the new evidence we've discovered.
Well, I have no doubt whatsoever that if the whole of what I have seen had been in front of the jury at the trial, they could not conceivably have convicted Mr. Clarke.
What do you think should happen now in terms of further investigation of Clarke's case?
Well, your program is called Rough Justice. If there is to be any justice at all, there must be a further and detailed and careful investigation. It doesn't seem to me that it's important who does it. It may be a reference to the Court of Appeal. It may be by someone like Sir Henry Fisher in the Confate case or Judge Hawser in the Hanratty case. But somebody ought to look at all the facts again with the knowledge that we now have, the evidence that we now have, and certainly listening to anything that may tend to disprove what we've seen in the programme, and at the end of the day come up with a recommendation which the Home Secretary should follow. And if whoever does it comes up with the sort of feelings that I've had as a result of seeing the programme, then undoubtedly Mr. Clarke should be pardoned and compensated for what happened.
Clarke has now served 4 years of his life sentence. If he behaves himself, he could get out in 1989. He is a man convicted of murder for 2 simple reasons. 1, he knew the dead girl, which he never denied. 2, he worked at the place where her body was found. The only other piece of evidence against him, this jumper, has now been completely discredited. Yet, here he stays in Wakefield prison, when he should never have been convicted in the first place.